Typhus and Quotas, 1921 transatlantic steamers diverted to Boston. I used the color of the bricks at Ellis Island for the background or margins of the New York slides of this talk. What to choose for Boston? Here's what I'll use: the city's official website color of Charles Blue. In helping someone locate at the port of Boston a passenger manifest for the SS Presidente Wilson, I found more steamers like it in 1921 going to Boston, diverted from the usual end-of-voyage route to New York Harbor. That led me to information about immigration records, typhus, and the effects of quotas on Ellis Island and Boston port traffic. Using the subscription service newspapers.com and searching for, quote, steamers diverted Boston, New York for 1921, I found many articles from the Boston Globe, Boston Post, and other newspapers on steamers diverted during February through May to Boston. I created a list of such ships which may not be complete. I did the same for the port of Philadelphia, though I'm going to emphasize Boston throughout this talk. I also used the free newspaper website at the Library of Congress, chronicling historic American newspapers. It's very nice. It's a free source. So here is a list of diverted steamers. I'm not sure how many there are. I know there are probably over 25. And here is a list of about, let's see how many I got, 7 that I found that were diverted from New York to Philadelphia during that period of time. Here is a chart from Boston showing immigrant aliens admitted through the port, and you'll see that in 1921 there was a dramatic increase in numbers of immigrants. So here are questions you will mostly get an answer to in this talk. Why were these ships diverted? What resources can we find in each port from those visits? What was the impact of the disease typhus and quotas on shipping and Ellis Island traffic? And what happened to the immigrants from those ships at those ports? So the talk segments are, first I'll give you some 1921 background on these diversions. Then we'll do a detailed look at the Presidente Wilson arriving in May 1921. I'll show you some additional steamers that I did some more research on, and then a conclusion. First, some background. Let me take you back to 1921. New York's Ellis Island, which opened in 1892, was still the major port for European immigrants' entry into the U.S., but the station's peak years were 1900 to 1914, when 5,000 to 10,000 immigrants were processed every day. If you want to know more about Ellis Island's history, I have a YouTube video on it. And on the show notes, I'm going to repeat the links to these resources. Things were changing in the 1920s. Immigrants now needed entry documents issued by U.S. consulates abroad, which also screened them for language skills, health matters, and manifest questions. That led to a reduction in inadmissible entrants. The role of Ellis Island was slowly being reduced for immigration screening. In fact, after 1924, it was used for many other purposes. There was also a shift in public opinion against immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Those immigrants were blamed for economic problems and bringing diseases to America. Remember, this was after World War I. The Emergency Immigration Act of 1921, effective as of June 3, 1921, set quotas on immigrants based on a percent of the 1910 census and ethnicity. In 1924, it was really more draconian what they did, pretty much cut it off entirely. As a result, there was a surge of immigrants coming to the U.S. before quotas fully went into effect. That's one reason for processing delays that were frequently happening at Ellis Island during that time. And then there was the disease typhus. February 1921, typhus outbreak in New York City. Perhaps it was a little exaggerated. Some people didn't think it was that serious. But typhus is spread by lice, quote, vermin, and poor sanitation. Typhus among some New York arriving passengers of the Presidente Wilson in the early February of 1921 was a major concern. I'm going to show you a bunch of quotes from newspaper articles, and this one from 1921 in February says, "There appears to be no adequate inspection of departing emigrants in the ports of Trieste and Naples, from which thousands of potential citizens are sailing for America every week." February 11th, for instance, had 3 ships quarantined until the 12-day period of typhus incubation expired. Also, quote, 1,000 passengers from the Lapland were taken to Ellis Island for inspection, but ordered back to their ship by Superintendent Baker because of their filthy condition. Or this one, the sailing of the Rindam has been deferred until next Tuesday, costing the shipping company some money. She was scheduled to depart today. The 1,500 steerage passengers of the Rindam were turned back by the authorities because many of them were found to have body lice. They are still aboard the vessel, officials said. Officials said that they intend to erect a delousing and disinfecting plant at Pier 7 Hoboken, where the Rindam is tied up. Ellis Island became so congested with steerage passengers as a result of the extra precautions taken by health officials that several steamers were diverted to other ports, mainly Boston, according to the Brooklyn Citizen. And in East Boston, their immigration station just opened in April of 1920. The 2010 report that I'm showing you here decided whether it was potentially good enough for landmark consideration, but the station was demolished in 2011. And this is from that report. It is important to note that the East Boston Immigration Station was not the entry point for every immigrant alien arriving at the port of Boston. Only those requiring additional review were brought to the facility, like a special inquiry center. Unlike Ellis Island, through which shouldn't be just every immigrant, but every steerage immigrant entering the port of New York was required to pass, Boston's immigration station saw only a small percentage of the total number of immigrants admitted through the port each year. It was more spread out, their processing. Immigration and public health officials would travel to the various piers on their boat, the Marietta, and would either board recently docked vessels or perform their inspections on shipping company docks, in which their rooms existed on some of the piers, examining passengers and reviewing their documentation. So the Boston Globe on February 24th was congratulating itself, saying so well satisfied are the various steamship companies with the work of the health and immigration officials at this port in connection with the steamers diverted here from New York, that they have announced that other steamers will be diverted to Boston to escape the delay that would result if they went direct to New York. This put pressure on a lot of the social agencies that were meeting these ships to help the immigrants. And, quote, because of the crowded conditions at Ellis Island and the stringent regulations regarding examinations for typhus inspection, a number of steamers which usually dock at New York Harbor were diverted during the month of February to the port of Boston. This sudden transfer to Boston of work usually taken care of by the immigrant aid representatives of, in this case, the Council of Jewish Women at Ellis Island, necessitated the development of the port work at Boston on a scale much larger than that hereto assumed by the council section of that city. So they had to reorganize in that area. Note that these shipping lines probably used New York as their base for European voyages, so the steamers at Boston would still have to go to New York to start their next voyage to pick up their passengers. A number of things could happen to these transatlantic passengers at Boston at that point. So look at case 1. Diverted passengers at Boston traveling to New York. The steamer Susquehanna arrived in Boston on February 7, 1921, with over 2,000 steerage passengers and 2 stowaways. It was diverted from New York. There are good articles in the Boston Globe, February 7th and 8th, that describe what happened to the steamship and its passengers. Quote, at New York, some of the steerage steamers have been delayed from 3 to 5 days because of the congested condition at Ellis Island. Quote, it was because the immigration quarters at Ellis Island are so crowded that the Susquehanna was diverted by wireless to Boston. It was already, on its voyage to facilitate the handling of the passengers. The city steamer monitor and the health boats Vigilant and Von Esdorf and a Navy lighter were used in transferring these passengers from the ship to Ellis Island. They were immediately bathed in a solution of soap and gasoline. That's a New York accent. Gasoline. Clothing thoroughly steamed. Meantime, the quarters of the passengers on the ship were being fumigated with sulfur to kill any typhus carrying vermin. However, the 74 cabin passengers were allowed to stay on board, and then finally 1,600 of the steerage group were put back on board the ship and moved to a pier. Another 400 women and children came up to the pier on the Monitor. The entire steerage will be examined this morning, actually it will be the next morning, by the immigration inspectors and their baggage inspected by customs officials. In fact, they found an illegal cognac liquor that they confiscated. According to the plan, the Susquehanna will leave Boston today for New York, carrying all but about 300 of the passengers who were destined for points around Boston. So here, the impression you get is that they're going to continue to New York, pretty much the entire passengers. The port physicians found the passengers in good condition physically, and they were pronounced a desirable class of immigrants. There were some cases of pneumonia and mumps among the foreigners on the way over, but most of those afflicted have fully recovered. Now, one of my assumptions here about the process, about the going to Boston first, is that immigrants, once they went through the Boston immigration procedures, and if they stayed on the ship and reached New York, they would not have to go through the procedures again. That should also explain where the records of these voyages are. They should be in Boston. But we're going to look at the SS Helif Olav later, in which that is not quite true. So here's cases 2. Diverted passengers at Boston traveling to New York. This is from the newspapers. And here's one from Springfield, Massachusetts. Immigrants go through city cars of them, railroad cars, are coming through from Boston, congestion at Ellis Island. And the article says they reports on special railroad cars added to trains with immigrants going on the way to Buffalo, New York and the West, and also to New York to complete final legal requirements. Not sure what those legal requirements are. The aid societies, like the American Israelite, reported on March 17th, this is reporting probably from the February problems, also dealt with incoming New York City train passengers from Boston. Quote, These trains have been coming into the New York railroad stations at the rate of 1 or 2 daily, usually reaching New York at midnight. As a result of this extraordinary situation, we have been called upon to render incoming train service, which is now part of what they were experiencing before. Boston diverted passengers, and the New York City Health Commissioner. It was a big deal for him. And the next discussion, the slides, are based on these references. It was all about examining immigrants for typhus. A dispute arose between the New York City Health Commissioner, Copeland, and the U.S. about testing immigrants for typhus and vermin. He was unhappy with the Boston-New York land pipeline. Quote, Copeland said that immigration inspection facilities in Atlantic ports, notably New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, were disgracefully ineffective. Copeland had health stations set up at New York City's Grand Central and Pennsylvania Railway terminals, and immigrants were put under a, quote, rigorous examination for signs of typhus. Not only physical signs, but they were looking for lice on their clothing. Copeland also had his health inspectors meet the coastwise steamship lines boats coming from Boston and tested any immigrants. He had immigrants retested at the barge office of the Battery even after they had been passed by the state health authorities at quarantine on the boats and then the federal officials at Ellis Island. So some of them were tested 3 times. Then, in May of 1921, a young boy died from typhus at Ellis Island. A typhus death at Ellis Island caused Ellis Island to shut down, and the immigrants were removed to a nearby island. No immigrants from vessels now in port or due to arrive will be permitted to land at Ellis Island, the article said, until the work of disinfection has been completed and the immigration station is now virtually under quarantine. The ban lasted 48 hours only. And here's the Boston Post headline. Line is being diverted here again, actually. As a result of the outbreak of typhus among the thousands of aliens detained at Ellis Island, New York, and the ever-growing influx from Europe in anticipation of the restriction of immigration, some of the steamship companies whose regular schedules do not include calls at Boston are finding it advantageous to send ships here to have the quarantine, customs, and immigration requirements carried out, thereby avoiding long and expensive delays at the metropolis. So it's really kind of sad. This is one of these classic pictures of a family in New York Harbor. They may not be on a ship, actually, looking at the Statue of Liberty, that these diverted ships are not going to get the experience of entering New York Harbor and seeing the Statue of Liberty. Instead, they're going to see something a little bit drabber. Remember, not everybody went to that immigration station. Philadelphia Inquirer, about the same time, reports that vessels with immigrants would be diverted to this port from New York were based upon the discovery of a case of typhus in Ellis Island. But the prompt action of the New York immigration authorities in fumigating has made this unnecessary. Although, as I showed you earlier, I have found at least 6 ships that were diverted to Philadelphia from New York. So let's look at my main example, working through the records, the Presidente Wilson. Now, often you'll see it kind of, the name is President Wilson. That was a separate ship. So this is the Presidente Wilson. Its May 1921 route was that it picked up initially passengers from Trieste, then Naples, Algiers, and then was diverted to Boston on its way into the U.S. on May 23rd, and by May 24th or so, it was in New York, the New York Harbor. This steamer was the impetus for this study. I'm going to present it as I did in my first draft of this talk, which did not include what I just showed you in part 1. Didn't know that stuff. Questions will be raised and then answered. So a good story demands a good example. I'll pick Nicola Benedetto for this voyage, also known as Nicola di Benedetto. He arrived on the Presidente Wilson as a 16-year-old. 3.5 years later, he took the first steps toward U.S. naturalization by filing his Declaration of Intention. The Declaration of Intention, or first papers, could be submitted by the immigrant without much help. No official checks the accuracy of the information shown on the form. Later, when Nicola started the process of producing a petition for naturalization, clerks would then verify his residence and arrival information. But that wasn't done for the declaration. So here is his Declaration of Intention. Nicola Benedetto, a laborer, born in Italy, etc., and he immigrated to the United States of America from Naples, Italy, on the vessel. See, they make a mistake here. It's the Presidente Wilson. And he says that I arrived farther down. I arrived at the port of New York, state of New York, on about the 21st of May, 1921. If I do a name search on Nicola, his full name, on the gold form at stevemorse.org for Ellis Island immigrants, I do not find him, nor any other passenger that used the same arrival information. Name search can't find him in the Ellis Island database. Why not? That's what I ask. What's my next step? What's your next step? Of course, one of the steps could be you could look at my YouTube video in which I show probably as many as a dozen ways of finding hidden, missing, hiding passengers on the Ellis Island manifests. One of my better endeavors. Since Nicola seems sure of the name of the ship and arrival date on his declaration, there are two things we could do to find his presumed New York ship manifest. The easiest would be the ship's book index. The naturalization clerks at Ellis Island use these extensively. So just to give you some idea of a flow chart, what the immigrants would do is they would fill out a preliminary form, which was going to lead to the petition. They would probably repeat the information they put on the Declaration of Intention. They went to Ellis Island. Ellis Island didn't go directly to the manifest to check their arrival. Instead, starting in 1906, each voyage not only gave a manifest to the officials, but also a book index showing all the people on the ship and where they were on the manifest pages. Show you pictures of that. And then they went into the manifest and went directly to that page. Saved them a lot of work. And if they found the person, yes, he arrived on this ship and this manifest and that line, they issue a certificate of arrival, which would become part of his eventual petition. I explained the process on another YouTube video called Manifest Destiny, described the book index, and also I have YouTube videos on the whole naturalization process and immigrant names and manifest searches, that one emphasizing the preliminary petition. There are two ways of using a book index. Use its name index, which is on Family Search, and hope it can compensate for bad handwriting and transcriptions, or look it up by ship name and then go to the D surname page of the images. We're going to be doing that. And doing actually another way as well. I'm going to cheat here a little. The book index transcription of his name is off from his actual name. So I'm going to search for what's there, which is Nicola di Benedetto. So if I go to Family Search, and I'm going to show you the link, and also in the show notes, they have the New York book indexes. You can do it by the name of the person, or you can browse the images, and I'm going to do both ways. If I enter Nicola and do an exact search. That's why the boxes on the right are checked off. I only find one person because I cheated. And there he is, Nicola di Benestetto. And if I look at that, it shows me the book index. It goes to the right page. It doesn't show me the name of the ship, though. In order to find that, I would have to go back in the book to the first cover. Hopefully it's still there, because it's used so much that sometimes it was not there. So here's a close-up of it. You can see that Nicola is there, and the 2421. 24 means that he was on sheet 24 of the manifest, and 21 is the line is on. These are all the Ds. So once you're in the Ds, it's sequenced by where they are located on the manifest. Very nice, very clever. So that looks promising. I mean, he's there. You might assume, therefore, that there's a ship manifest at Ellis Island to back up that entry. Another way of finding, and there's other ways too, but this way of finding Nicola's ship manifest at Ellis Island is to use the ship list at the one-step site at stevemorse.org. Once we have the ship name, we can use this sheet and line number to find them. So I go to the one-step site. I go to the ship list for Ellis Island. It says that a lot of people contributed to do this, a lot of volunteers, a whole team of them. And this was done off of the records of the National Archives and Records Administration. This is not based on ship arrival lists published in newspapers. And so we thank these people. This was done probably 2 decades ago for a tremendous amount of work going through the films and figuring out where every ship was and its location on the films. So here is the utility. And I'll blow this up. We're not going to put too much on here. I'm asking for ships that arrived in May of 1921. And the port name is Trieste because that's where Nicola came from. Just those 2 things. And then I say, show me those ships. And there's the Presidente Wilson, also the Argentina, which we'll talk about later. There's a link there, so I can actually look at the manifest. And when I do so, the first thing I see are the list of the employees on the vessel. You can see it says the Presidente Wilson arriving in New York, May of 1921. Doesn't show the date, but on the bottom right, I'll blow this up. It says all checks made by indelible pencil were inspected at New York, May 25th, 1921. So some of these crew members, it looks like this is a template, may not be there anymore. They would not be checked off. And another one. But something's missing. There's no sign of the passengers aboard the Presidente Wilson on this Ellis Island manifest. They're not there. It's just the crew. Would you think that the immigration or naturalization officials lost the passenger manifest? Or that when they filmed the manifest, they skipped the pages? We can't check since the original manifests were destroyed in the late 1940s after filming. Let's look again at these book indexes from New York, showing another way of doing it, and there's some more information there, actually. Really nice. So, we're going to browse all 748,000 images. I hope you have time to watch this. And actually what it does is it will show you rolls, which is broken down by shipping lines, by year, by month. And this is actually wrong because the Presidente Wilson was part of the U.S. mail line, but they put it in the Italian group here. So we're going to look at roll 327, and we're going to look at the front of the book. Here is the Presidente Wilson arriving May 25th, 1921. And then that's not really the cover of the book. Here's the cover. Let's blow that up. There's some interesting stuff there. First of all, it says steerage. Actually, not only are steerage there, but first and second cabins are there. It says Boston arrivals. Does that mean that it's from Boston? I don't understand that. But just a second. We'll blow up the bottom. And then it's very clear that the passengers landed at Boston. They landed at Boston. Aha! Let's see what the Port of Boston has as to the records of this ship in May of 1921. They have the book index, they have the ship lists, and they have the manifest sheets. And Family Search has some excellent resources here in terms of the Boston passenger lists. So here's one of the indexes. I enter for Boston, remember we're in Boston now, Nicola Di Benedetto. I'm going to use his actual name. And I say, okay, show me what happens. I'm not using an exact search. I get 21 people, and I go down the list, and one of them immigrated in 1921. Aha, that's what the one I want right there. I click on it. We're in Boston. And I see, well, no, that's not correct. He's not a female. What's more important, and there's nothing there on the book index that tells you the sex of the person. But more important is that one of the problems with the Family Search is even though they usually get you to the right page, they mislink the name of the ship. This is not the Pocahontas. We'll talk about the Pocahontas later. And in order to show you that, I'm on image 39 of 698. I have to go back to the beginning of the book. And if I go back to image 31, you can see clearly it's the Presidente Wilson. And in this case, it's just the steerage people, because if I go back farther to image 6, I see the first and second cabin people. So there's actually two of these book indexes. If I can compare the Ellis Island book index on the left and the Boston one on the right, it looks like they're made by the same person. So they actually made copies of this. It's really kind of interesting because the book index in Ellis Island, there's no passenger manifest there. Was there one with them? Did they make a copy of it? It's not clear why it's there. Here's another one where we can actually go and trying to figure out the manifests in Boston. Again, I would rather see the images directly rather than do a name search, and that's what I'm doing here. I look and roll 267 looks what the ship came in Boston. I'm looking for the passenger list, so I look at that, and I find on image 181 of 889. I go through this quickly. There is list 24 of the Presidente Wilson. Remember, 24. What was the next number? What was his line number? Well, his line number was 21. That's how you get to it quickly. And he was admitted, but he had some problems. If you look closely, there's an SI, Special Inquiry, on the left, just above the arrow. He said he was 16, which is probably the minimum age for a person traveling alone, but he was actually 15. And so that's what they were concerned about, but they let him through. There's one other thing here I want to point out to you, which is this number here. There's another one farther up, CA, which is Certificate of Arrival. When the clerks look for the person for the petition to issue a certificate of arrival, they were told, starting in the late 1920s, to put down the court that's asked for it, the two dashes, the New York area, and the number of the certificate that they issue. They did this because there was fraud in Ellis Island, and some immigrants were using the same person for multiple applications. So in order to avoid that, they did this. So if we look at Nicoled's online documentation for naturalization, in which he says that he came in New York, we can actually see his certificate of arrival. And no, he came in through Boston. That's where the official papers are. So he was, quote, mistaken of where he legally entered the United States. Now, typically, you also see on here the number of the certificate of arrival can't be used actually to figure out where the naturalization papers are. So how many immigrants put the wrong port of entry on their citizenship applications? Do I have a handle on that? Yes, I do. Using a sample of 791 New Orleans 1920s preliminary petitions forms, determine that number. Remember, their arrival information would probably be the same as the declaration, and then that would have to be verified. I only counted major location errors, not, for instance, area variations. So people would put down, where did you arrive, Ellis Island? Another person would put down New York. Another person might put down Hoboken or Brooklyn. Those are all the port of New York. Those are not errors. For Canadian border crossings, I accepted the nearby U.S. areas reached. I found only 12 of the 791 immigrant forms, or less than 2%, or 1 out of 50 of their stated landing sites were incorrect. There's a bunch of other assumptions here, which I don't have time to go over. Not remembering their ship's name or arrival date seemed to be the most common problems encountered by naturalization clerks, besides name variations. So I went over the ship manifest of the Presidente Wilson and followed up on any immigrant that showed a New York area certificate of arrival request notation, because I knew that most of them I could see their full naturalization papers online. Of 18 naturalization records found, all the petitions or certificate of arrivals said Boston. But of the 13 who had their declaration forms as well, like Nicola, 4 put down New York as their entry point. That's 31% were wrong. And actually there was a 5th one as well that had stamped on it New York, was crossed out on the declaration, and then he put down Boston. So why are so many of these immigrants putting down New York as their landing point? And probably it was told and retold to their ancestors and finally reached the puzzled genealogy researcher. Well, going back to the passenger list, there's list 24. It's a 2-page affair, and you can see that the manifest says they're arriving at the port of New York. These ship manifests were created by the shipping company before the voyage started. Although I do have some exceptions that you'll see later, which is very unusual because this tends to be, always told you that ship manifests are created before the voyage started. Next question. How regular was it then for the Presidente Wilson to visit Boston before they went to New York? I still wasn't thinking about the ship being actually diverted. There must be something going on. That was before I looked at the newspapers. So I looked for a ship schedule for the steamer for 1921, but was not successful. But there is another thing we can do. There is the ship list on the One Step website. There's also one for Boston. So what I can do is I can look at the New York arrivals, let's say between May 1st, 1920 to June 31st, 1922, ask for the Presidente Wilson, and then look at the Boston arrivals, and you can see that during this period of time, this was the only voyage of the Presidente Wilson that went to Boston. It wasn't a regular part of its route. So let's look at the New York passengers. Because I'm always interested in how did they get there? How did they get from Boston to New York? So the Boston Post said that this ship was diverted to Boston because of the discovery of typhus among immigrants held at Ellis Island. The Presidente Wilson arrived in the harbor yesterday. After several hours' detention at quarantine, the liner came up to a berth in East Boston. Just before dark last evening, she was on her way to New York, to which port she was originally destined. She was in a hurry, leaving at dark, and I'll tell you why she was in a hurry in a second. So the Brooklyn Daily Times now says about this same ship, she's now in New York, that this is the first time since before the war that one of the big transatlantic liners has tied up and started the discharge of passengers at so late an hour. It's almost midnight. But every minute between now and Saturday is to be utilized in refitting and conditioning the ship for Saturday's big sailing. What was Saturday's big sailing? I'll tell you about it in a second. So where did the passengers go? There are a lot of passengers that were in Boston. Well, what I can do is there are shipping notices. So when the Presidente Wilson arrived in Boston on the 23rd, according to the Boston Globe, it had 12 first, 376 second class, and 817 steerage passengers. And although the New York manifest of the Presidente Wilson for May 23rd showed no passengers, just crew, it arrived, according to the New York Tribune, it arrived with 9 first, 26 second, and 388 steerage third class passengers. So a lot of people did leave the boat in, if these numbers are accurate, in Boston, but they remained on the boat going to New York, and presumably didn't have to go through immigration twice. Now, why was this important to get to New York? Because the ship's next voyage would have had the ailing opera singer Enrico Caruso and his large entourage. He sailed on the Presidente Wilson on May 29, 1921, to Naples. 1,000 people saw him off. It was said the trip cost him $32,000. He had 6 cabins. His entourage all had cabins. That's about $500,000 today. He died in Naples on August 2nd, 1921, according to the New York Tribune. I want to show you some other diverted steamer records and their passenger landings. We talked earlier about the steamer Susquehanna, with the 2,000-plus steerage passengers and her 2 stowaways. A manifest sheets at Boston show New York as the arriving port. Only the stowaway's manifest sheet is on the New York National Archives films. The rest of the passengers are not there. I could not find a New York book index, like we did find it for the Presidente, even if it was not needed. Boston has the full records, the manifest and book index. Another ship, the steamer Helif Olav, was diverted to Boston from New York, arriving late on March 9, 1921. Like the Susquehanna, only the steerage passengers took baths at Ellis Island in Boston. It berthed later on the 10th. There were 193 cabin passengers. They didn't have to take baths. The next stop was its original destination of New York. So this is from the Boston Globe. We find from the Globe article, and I'm sharing it with you, we find that, quote, it has not as yet been decided whether the cabin passengers will be taken around to New York on the steamer or landed here in Boston. The fact that the steamer will have to make a formal entry here and then clear for New York may prevent her from taking the passengers to the metropolis, as foreign steamers cannot carry passengers between coastwise ports. Well, that's very interesting, because that throws my assumptions, out the window. It turned out, actually, that's not quite accurate. You never know from newspapers whether they are accurate or not. But that's a potential problem. We can find at the New York Archives that there is a partial manifest from our voyage, with manifest designations of New York. It shows 165 passengers, I counted them, And another 28 crossed off, but indicating on the sheets they landed in Boston. And those, well, I'll tell you about that in a second. So that's 193. So it matches the cabin, first and second cabins. So my conclusion is that most of the cabin passengers stayed on the ship and landed in New York, but not the steerage. I cannot find a book index in New York for the ship, but Boston does have one. I then looked for the Olav's arrival in New York on the New York Herald shipping news, and, quote, arrived, STR Helif Olav Dane, Copenhagen, February 25th, Christiania, 26th in Boston, March 11th, to some company with 28 first, 137 second cabin passengers and merchandise. All steerage passengers were landed at Boston. Now let's take one person on this ship, on the New York Manifest, whose name is crossed off, and who landed in Boston. Somebody by the name of Jamal Wolf. He is on what's list 5, line 6, on the Boston part of the manifest. Now, those sheets show those people arriving at Boston. It's typed over Boston. So we have manifests in New York that say New York arrival, and we have manifests in Boston saying Boston arrival. And this person's manifest in Boston is a sheet with only 4 passengers. So it's a different manifest sheet. Which listing is on the original manifest and which a new one? So here, when they got diverted, the person on the ship responsible for the passengers must have created some new manifests. The New York manifest sheets have a number of crossed out lines with not shipped over them. Those people didn't make the ship. So that is a sign that they could be the original manifest for the cabin passengers, and the ones who decided to land in Boston had to have something physical, so they made new manifest sheets for those. Wolf cannot be found on the book index in Boston. There is one. My feeling is that the first, maybe in second class, were not transferred to the book indexes, but he is on the Boston passenger list. The steamer Argentina in May 1921 was diverted to Boston from a New York landing. She went next to New York. Boston has the full passenger manifest. New York records have a single manifest sheet of 9 passengers from a voyage. Those 9 are on a different manifest sheets than the Boston material. In other words, if these 9 passengers are on 2 different manifest sheets, and again, I think that the manifests for these 9 who had special requirements, I think, that's the reason why they're on the New York Manifest, was created just when they diverted the ship. Both ports have a copy of the book index, which is really useless for New York. I'm not quite sure why they do that. And then the last one, the steamer Pocahontas, was diverted to Boston on both their April and May 1921 voyages, and then went to New York, and I know that from shipping records. Boston has her records. The manifest sheets show New York as the destination. The New York records do not have the book indexes or any manifest sheets for her visits, like she never got there. Our full records are in the Boston Archive films. So what's my conclusion? Researchers looking for records of immigrants arriving in the U.S. in 1921, whose family stories say they arrived at Ellis Island, but who cannot be found there by name index, or the full records of their purported arrival ships as well, would be well served if they look for the same records at the port of Boston or the port of Philadelphia. So I hope you enjoyed that. This is another of my JDW talks. I have YouTube talks on genealogy topics, census resources, Ellis Island, immigration. And half of them are devoted to that of my over 100 talks, and the other half are from natural history topics, virtual birding field trips, and birding optics. And with that, I hope that those of you who are struggling for 1921 arrivals might have more insight now into where you might look for the records if at first you do not succeed. So, thanks for watching.